He scraped together coins to buy a simple birthday cake, never expecting the woman behind the counter would rewrite their entire future with a single quiet gesture. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? Leif Danner turned the peanut butter jar upside down, and the coins clinked against the kitchen table like raindrops on a tin roof. Dimes, nickels, a few quarters, and a crumpled $2 bill he'd forgotten about. The jar had once held spare change from gas stations, snacks, and soda machines. Now it held something else entirely. Hope, maybe, or desperation masked as determination. He lined the coins up in neat little stacks, counting in silence while his daughter colored quietly at the end of the table. Amelie hummed as she filled in the petals of a hand-drawn sunflower. Her hair was tied in a loose braid, already coming undone after a long day at school. She didn't know he'd skipped lunch again to save a few dollars, didn't know he'd turned down an extra shift because it would have made him late for her school play. All she knew was that tomorrow was her 7th birthday, and she wanted a cake with her name on it. Leif jotted the final total on the back of an old envelope. It would be tight. He might have to ask the bakery if they had something small, maybe a cupcake they could put a candle in. He could make it special. He always found a way. The heater groaned through the walls as wind rattled the windows. March in Fern Hollow was still stubborn with winter, and the mountains liked to keep their frost well into spring. Leif stood stretching his sore back. His mechanic's uniform still smelled of grease and cold metal, and his fingers were stained black from a muffler job he'd barely finished in time to pick up Amelie from school. She looked up. "Dad, are we going to get the cake from the place with the golden window again?" He nodded. "Yeah, sweetheart. We'll go first thing tomorrow morning." Amelie beamed. "I hope they have the purple one." He smiled and tucked the envelope into his coat pocket. "Me too." Later that night, after Amelie was asleep, Leif sat at the table again. He picked up one of the coins and turned it over between his fingers. Just enough. Not much more, but maybe, just maybe, enough to make her feel celebrated. That would be more than enough for him. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, just a soft amber glow stretching over the rooftops like a whispered promise. Leif held Amelie's hand as they walked down Main Street, their breath visible in the morning chill. Most of the storefronts were still dark, their signs faded, windows shuttered like tired eyes unwilling to open. But halfway down the block, nestled between an old clock repair shop and a dusty bookstore, a single window glowed gold against the frost. Marigold and hearth. It was the only light for blocks. The warmth spilled onto the sidewalk, catching in the steam rising from a tiny grate below the door. The smell of fresh bread and cinnamon cut through the cold, wrapping around them like an invisible blanket. Amelie tugged at his sleeve, bouncing just a little on her toes. She knew this place. Knew the bell above the door jingled like a wind chime, and the floor creaked on the third step in. She'd been here once before, last spring, for a muffin they couldn't afford, gifted to her anyway by a kind woman with flour on her cheek and a sadness in her smile. Leif pushed the door open and the bell chimed like before. Inside, the air was thick with warmth and butter. Wooden shelves lined the walls, stacked with pastries, dusted in powdered sugar, loaves of sourdough glistening with melted glaze, and small cakes, each more delicate than the next. It looked like a fairy tale had opened a kitchen. Amelie stepped in slowly, like she didn't want to scare the magic. Her eyes widened at the cakes behind the glass. Chocolate curls, piped roses, golden leaves sculpted from sugar. Leif cleared his throat, stepping toward the counter. "Morning," he said, voice rough from sleep and nerves. From the back came a rustle, then soft footsteps. The woman emerged, apron tied loosely at her waist, sleeves rolled to the elbows. Her dark hair was pulled into a low bun, a smear of flour across her forearm. Same woman, same quiet eyes. "Good morning," she said. No recognition in her face, just warmth. "Cold out there, huh?" He nodded. "We were hoping to get something small, for a birthday." The woman glanced at Amelie, who gave a shy wave. "Let's see what we can do," she said gently, walking toward the glass case. And just like that, the golden window let them in. Serafina Vexley moved with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to stay unseen in plain sight. She wiped her hands on the hem of her apron, still dusted in flour, and offered a small smile as she knelt to retrieve a cake from the display. It wasn't the biggest one in the case, not the kind that turned heads at weddings or took days to craft, but it had hand-piped violets around the edges and a simplicity that felt honest. Honest was something she could offer, even if she couldn't offer much else. She stood slowly, catching sight of the man again, Leif, though she didn't know his name yet. There was something in the way he stood, shoulders back, boots worn through, one hand resting protectively on the shoulder of the little girl at his side. Her braid was crooked, likely tied by him in a rush, and her coat sleeve had a patch sewn with care. Serafina noticed things like that, not because she was curious, because noticing helped her stay grounded. It kept her from remembering too much. "Would this do?" she asked softly, her voice more of a breath than a question. The man nodded, relief flickering across his face. "It's perfect," he said. Though Serafina saw the quick scan he gave to the price tag, she reached for a box, carefully easing the cake inside as if it were more than a dessert, like it was a wish being wrapped. As she worked, she glanced at the girl. "Birthday today?" The child nodded, beaming. "I'm 7. Serafina's smile deepened, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "7's a lucky number." She sealed the box and placed it gently on the counter, then looked up, really looked, for the first time. His eyes were tired and his coat smelled faintly of engine grease, but he was steady, solid. A man who didn't ask for much but gave everything he had, the kind that still existed in stories but rarely in cities. He reached into his pocket and began placing coins on the counter, fingers moving slowly, carefully counting. Serafina watched without saying a word. When he finished, he looked up, expectant. She glanced at the pile and nodded. "Exactly enough, she said. And for the first time that morning, her smile held. Leif's eyes drifted across the glass, scanning each pastry with the careful calculation of a man who couldn't afford to be wrong. There were raspberry tarts and caramel eclairs, each one a masterpiece of color and shine. But his gaze landed on a small vanilla cake, almost hidden behind a row of fruit-stacked scones. It wasn't flashy, just pale buttercream, smooth as river stone, with tiny lavender blossoms piped around the base and a single sugar daisy in the center. He pointed. "That one!" Serafina followed his finger and paused. The cake wasn't supposed to be there. She'd made it the night before on a whim, not because it had been ordered, but because the kitchen had felt too quiet and her hands needed to remember something gentle. It was meant for no one, or maybe just for her. A reminder that even the quietest hours could produce something beautiful. She hesitated only a moment before sliding the glass panel open and lifting the cake out with both hands. "You sure?" she asked, already placing it on the counter. Leif gave a nod. "It's the right size, and my daughter loves anything with flowers on it." Amelie stepped forward, eyes wide. "It's perfect." Serafina looked at her, then at Leif, and something inside her softened even more. There was something about the way they looked at the cake, not like a treat, but like a promise, a memory waiting to be made. "It wasn't reserved?" Leif asked, uncertainty creeping into his voice. "No," Serafina said, her voice calm and quiet. "It was waiting for the right person." Leif offered a small, surprised smile. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just watched as she boxed the cake with steady, delicate movements, like she was tucking away something fragile. It had been made with no name, no plan. But as she folded the corners of the box and tied it with a thin blue ribbon, Serafina knew it belonged to someone now, to a girl turning 7, to a father who counted coins, to the story that was starting before any of them even realized it. Leif pulled the envelope from his coat pocket and unfolded it with care, revealing a mess of coins wrapped in paper towel and rubber bands. He untangled it on the counter, working silently, methodically. A few quarters clinked onto the wood, followed by scattered nickels, a thin stack of dimes, and a final, lonely penny that rolled briefly before settling near Serafina's elbow. She didn't speak. He lined them up into careful rows, just as he had on the kitchen table the night before. His fingers trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the quiet weight of being seen. There was no wallet, no credit card, just metal and memory and the silent hope that this morning would be enough. "I think," Leaf started, then paused to double-check the tally in his mind. "That should cover it." He glanced up, bracing for polite discomfort or quiet rejection. But Serafina said nothing. Her gaze drifted across the small mountain of tarnished coins, some so worn the ridges had faded smooth. These weren't quarters from glove compartments or tips from a lunch counter. These were from couch cushions and floorboards, from sacrifice. She could have pulled the price sheet, could have adjusted for tax, but she didn't. Instead, she met his eyes and said gently, "Perfect. Exactly enough." Leif blinked. "Really?" Serafina nodded, already slipping the ribboned box into a paper bag. "Really." He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Amelie, who had been busy tracing her finger along the edge of a pastry plate, tugged at his sleeve. "Did we do it, Dad?" Leif smiled, brushing her hair back. "We did, Bug. You've got your birthday cake." Amelie beamed. Serafina handed the bag to Leif with both hands, as though passing off something far more delicate than sponge and frosting. "No candle?" Amelie asked, peeking inside. Serafina hesitated, then reached beneath the counter and pulled out a single candle wrapped in wax paper. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. She placed it on top of the bag, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every wish deserves a light." The bell above the bakery door jingled as Leif and Amelie stepped back into the cold. The wind had picked up since they'd gone in, tugging at Amelie's scarf and nipping at the corners of Leif's jacket. But the warmth from inside clung to them a little longer. The smell of cinnamon, the softness of a voice that didn't judge, the box in Leif's hands carrying more than just sugar and sponge. They walked in silence for a bit, their boots crunching against patches of ice and gravel. Amelie skipped a little ahead, the paper bag swinging gently from her mittened hands, her braid bouncing with each step. She looked back at her father, eyes thoughtful. "Dad?" she asked, slowing her pace. "Yeah, Bug?" "That lady, the one in the bakery, Miss Sarah." She hesitated. Why did she look like she wanted to cry? Leif was quiet. He hadn't expected the question, but once it was out in the air, it didn't seem so strange. He'd noticed it too, the way Serafina's smile had lingered just a second too long, the way her eyes seemed shiny without blinking, like she was holding something in that couldn't be seen or named. Like the kindness she gave had a cost, and today she'd paid it. "I don't know," he said finally, adjusting the weight of the cake in his arms. "Maybe she was just having a hard day." Amelie nodded slowly, her nose pink from the cold. But she was still really nice. "Yeah," Leif said softly. "She was." They crossed the street toward the parking lot where his old sedan waited, its windows fogged from the sudden burst of warmth they'd carried with them. Leif unlocked the door and set the cake gently on the back seat like it was something sacred. Maybe it was. As he buckled Amelie in, he glanced back toward the bakery. The golden light still glowed behind the frosted window, but the silhouette inside had vanished. He didn't know why she looked like she wanted to cry, but something told him it wasn't the first time she had. The house smelled faintly of radiator heat and old books, with a trace of motor oil still clinging to Leif's jacket as he hung it on the back of the kitchen chair. Amelie kicked off her boots, already talking to her stuffed rabbit about the best birthday cake in the whole entire town, while Leif carefully set the bakery bag on the counter. The golden window from Marigold and Hearth had vanished behind them, but its warmth lingered, like it had followed them home and refused to leave. He untied the ribbon slowly, lifting the lid from the box with the kind of caution usually reserved for antique china or buried memories. There it was, the vanilla cake with its sugar daisy and violet trim, Still perfect, still more beautiful than he thought he could afford. "Happy birthday, Bug," he said, stepping aside so Amelie could get a better look. Her eyes widened. "It's even prettier now." Leif chuckled, brushing his hand over her hair. "And it's all yours." But as he reached back into the bag to remove the receipt or napkins, his fingers brushed against something else. Another box. Smaller. Unmarked. He frowned and pulled it out, lifting the lid. Inside sat a single cupcake, soft lavender frosting, swirled high with a tiny white chocolate star on top. It wasn't part of their order. Wasn't something he'd seen her pack. It had just appeared like a secret tucked between paper and kindness. A folded note rested at the bottom. He opened it carefully, the handwriting neat and slanted, for someone brave. He stared at it for a long moment, the words sitting heavier than the cupcake in his palm. Amelie peeked up. "Who's it for?" Leif didn't answer right away. He just held it out to her. "You, I think." She took it gently, cradling it like a treasure. "Do brave people always get cupcakes?" "Only the really special ones," he said softly. But even as Amelie giggled and ran to find a candle, Leif stood there, staring at the note. It wasn't addressed to anyone, and yet, somehow, it felt like Serafina Vexley had seen something in both of them she wasn't ready to say out loud. The house had grown quiet, the kind of stillness that only settled in after bedtime stories had been read, toys returned to shelves, and lights dimmed to soft glows. Leif stood in the doorway of Amelie's room, arms crossed loosely, watching her shift beneath her covers as she cradled the stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was a toddler. The lavender cupcake sat on her nightstand, untouched except for the little chocolate star she'd eaten first, like saving the rest made the magic last longer. "Dad?" Her voice broke the silence, soft and far away. "Yeah, Bug?" "That bakery," she said, drawing the word out like it was part of a lullaby. It felt like a dream. Leif smiled, though it was slow and a little sad around the edges. He stepped farther into the room, crouching beside her bed as she shifted to face him. "Like a dream how?" he asked, brushing her bangs back from her forehead. Amelie blinked up at the ceiling as if searching for the right words. Like everything smelled like happiness. And the cakes looked like birthday wishes. And the lady behind the counter. She paused. She was like a fairy, kind of, not the sparkly kind, the quiet kind. Leif's throat tightened for reasons he didn't fully understand. Maybe it was the way his daughter noticed things other kids didn't. Maybe it was because she said exactly what he'd felt, standing in that shop with the warm light, the flower-sweet air, and a woman who smiled like it hurt. "I think she's lonely," Amelie added softly, almost like a confession. "But nice." Leif nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think so too." He leaned in and kissed her forehead. "You're something special, kiddo." "I know," she said, grinning with sleepy pride. Leif stood and walked to the door, glancing back one more time. The cupcake's frosting shimmered faintly in the low light, like a tiny moon waiting for morning. As he turned off the lamp, Amelie yawned. "Maybe we should go back there someday, even if it's not my birthday." Leif paused, hand on the switch. "Maybe we will," he said. And in the quiet that followed, he realized part of him really wanted to. 3 days later, the weather turned. Rain swept down from the mountains in thick, wind-lashed sheets that turned streets to rivers and roofs into drums. The sky was a colorless gray, hanging low and restless above the small town of Fern Hollow. Leif sat behind the wheel of his old sedan, wipers smearing the windshield more than clearing it, as Amelie sat in the back, humming to herself and watching the drops race each other down the glass. He wasn't headed anywhere in particular, just circling town between errands, trying to find a spark of peace in the motion. He passed the post office, the gas station with the flickering sign, the closed library with plastic sheeting on the roof, and then, without meaning to, he found himself slowing as they approached the bakery, Marigold and Hearth. But something was wrong. The golden glow that had lit the window days ago was gone. The lights were off, the interior dark and hushed. Water beaded down the glass like tears, and the flower boxes below the window sagged under the weight of the rain. Leif pulled to the curb, engine idling, and leaned forward, squinting through the storm. Taped to the inside of the door was a sheet of white paper. The words were handwritten, neat but rushed. Temporarily closed due to water damage. Thank you for your kindness. We'll be back soon. Leif stared at it longer than he meant to. He didn't know why it hit him like it did. Maybe because the last time he'd seen that door, it had opened into something warmer than anything he'd felt in a while. Maybe because he'd just assumed it would always be there. Is she okay? Amelie asked from the back seat. He turned slightly. I don't know, Bug. Do you think her cakes got ruined? Maybe. Amelie frowned. She'll be sad. Leif nodded slowly. Yeah, she might be. The light changed at the corner. Leif hesitated before easing back onto the road, the sign still etched in his mind. Something about it felt final, or maybe like a pause, one he hoped wouldn't last too long. The storm had passed, but the sky still hung heavy, with the smell of wet earth and splintered wood. Puddles gathered in crooked seams along the sidewalks, and the scent of rain lingered in the air like a reminder that not everything dries at the same speed. Leif wasn't sure why he turned down Maple Street that morning. He didn't need anything from downtown. He wasn't running errands. He just wondered. Marigold and Hearth stood there like a page left open to the weather. The window was bare now. No pastries, no golden light. Just a streak of watermarks and the faded remains of the sign still taped to the glass. But as he pulled closer, Leif spotted her. Serafina. She was on her knees outside the back entrance, sleeves rolled, a tarp flung to one side. Buckets surrounded her like a makeshift fortress, and her hands were stained with something between grit and effort. She didn't see him at first. She was focused, screwdriver clenched, jaw tight, her hair falling loose from the clip at her neck. Leif parked without thinking. By the time his boots hit the wet pavement, Serafina had looked up, not startled, just quietly surprised, like she'd forgotten she existed outside of this mess. Their eyes met. No pretense, no smile. I heard about the water, Leif said, stepping closer, the rain-soaked gravel crunching beneath his feet. You need a hand? She blinked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. It's under control. It wasn't. The drain pipe beside her was crooked, detached from the wall at the top. The gutters above sagged. One of the buckets had already overflowed, its contents streaking a pale brown line down the brick. I don't mind, he said simply. She looked at him, and for a moment he thought she might say no again, but instead she exhaled and shifted aside. The downspouts rusted through. I've got tools in the truck, Leif replied. Won't take long. Serafina nodded, eyes softening but still cautious. No strings? He gave a small smile. Not everything has to come with strings. And just like that, the silence between them changed. Not erased, but filled with something steadier than words. The scent was the first thing that told the town Marigold and Hearth had come back to life. Not an announcement or a social media post, just the smell of brown butter and vanilla winding through the air again, curling around doorways and drawing people in like a forgotten lullaby. Leif smelled it before he saw the lights. He and Amelie were walking home from the grocery store, her arms wrapped around a box of cereal like it was treasure, when the wind shifted and carried something warm into their path. Amelie stopped mid-step. Dad, it's back. He followed her gaze. The golden window glowed again, soft and steady. Inside, the shelves were full, loaves of bread stacked like storybooks, lemon bars glistening beneath glass domes, a tray of cookies cooling near the back, edges crisped just right. And Serafina, behind the counter once more, tying an apron at her waist like she had never left. They didn't go in, not that day. Leif had always believed in giving people space to find their rhythm again. But the next morning, a note arrived at his garage. Folded and pinned to the door with a bit of tape, it was written in Serafina's careful script. "You fixed more than the gutter. Come by tomorrow, not as customers, as guests. Please. S." That "please" did something to him. He showed Amelie the note that evening, and she gasped like it was a secret invitation to a castle. "What do you think she means?" she asked, eyes wide. "I think," Leif said slowly, "she wants to thank us." So the next day they went. When the bell over the bakery door chimed again, Serafina looked up, and this time her smile wasn't quiet. It was full, hesitant maybe, but real. She stepped out from behind the counter with a tray already in her hands, a little lemon tart for Amelie, and a thick slice of honey loaf for Leif. "No lines today," she said. "No cash register either." Amelie beamed. "Are we special?" Serafina's gaze flicked to Leif, then back to Amelie. "Yes, very." And for once no one corrected her. The bakery felt different that afternoon. Quieter, slower, like it was breathing in for the first time in days. No customers filtered through the door, no rush of orders or clatter of coins. Just sunlight slanting through the golden window, warming the polished wood of the counter, and the tops of the scones cooling nearby. Serafina had locked the front early, not because she was done working, but because for once she wanted to stop. Leif and Amelie sat at the little round table near the window, the same one where an old couple used to play cards on Sunday mornings. The light touched Amelie's cheeks as she swung her legs beneath the chair, eyes wide with anticipation. She kept looking at the closed sign on the door and then back at Serafina, like she wasn't sure this moment was allowed. Serafina placed a steaming pot of tea in the center of the table and smiled as she set down 3 mismatched cups, each chipped in a different corner. Then came the scones, freshly baked, buttery and warm, dusted in cinnamon sugar. She sat with them, no apron this time, just a cardigan too big for her frame and sleeves that swallowed her wrists. Amelie picked up a scone and took the first bite with ceremony. She said dramatically. "This is magic." Leif chuckled. "You've got a food critic on your hands?" Serafina smiled. "That's the highest praise I've had in a long time." Amelie took another bite, then looked at her thoughtfully. "Can I call you Miss Sarah?" Serafina blinked, caught off guard. "You can call me whatever you like." "Miss Sarah," Amelie said again, testing it out like a melody. "It sounds like someone from a fairy tale." Leif raised an eyebrow. "She kind of is." Serafina looked down at her tea, cheeks just slightly pink. They sat there a while longer, the 3 of them, sipping tea and sharing scones as the afternoon faded into golden quiet. No one talked about the storm, or repairs, or coins, or cakes. They just existed together, warm and full and almost safe. And from that day forward, the name Miss Sarah stayed. It started like most quiet things in Fern Hollow, without warning and without fuss. Just a stranger wandering into town, camera slung over one shoulder, notebook poking out from a backpack patched with foreign flags and coffee stains. He arrived on a crisp Thursday morning, asking where to find the best place for a real local pastry. 3 people pointed him toward Marigold and Hearth without hesitation. By the time he pushed open the bakery door, the scent of cardamom and vanilla hung in the air like a welcome mat. Serafina looked up from the counter, hands dusted in flour, sleeves rolled, her hair tied in its usual low knot. The man smiled, introduced himself as Theo. "Just passing through," he said, and ordered a cranberry scone and a cup of whatever tea she liked best. She made chamomile. Amelie was there too, drawing quietly at the window table, her rabbit toy seated beside her like a tiny guest. Leif walked in a few minutes later to drop off a new filter for the kitchen sink, just something he'd noticed needed fixing the day before. Theo watched the way Serafina's eyes softened when she saw Leif. Not romantic, not obvious, but unmistakably different. The way someone looks at someone they trust, maybe for the first time in years. Theo didn't ask many questions. He just listened, took photos of the pastries, scribbled a few notes. Asked Amelie if the scones were always that good. She nodded enthusiastically and said, "Miss Sarah makes the best everything." That evening, he posted an entry to his blog, "Small Town Magic in the Mountains," a bake shop called Marigold and Hearth, a woman with the quiet grace of someone who's lost something and learned how to keep going, and a mechanic who fixes more than just broken things. Come for the cake, stay for the story. The next day, the post had over 1,000 shares. Serafina didn't notice until someone from 3 towns over showed up, asking for the cake that saved the little girl's birthday. She looked confused. Leaf just grinned and said, "I think we've been found." And though she never said it out loud, Serafina saved a copy of that post, printed it quietly, folded it into a book on her shelf, just in case the quiet parts of her life ever needed to be remembered. The first rumor didn't start in Fern Hollow. It started online, somewhere in the tangled threads of comment sections and cafe blogs, beneath the surface of Theo's quiet post. A reader asked about the name, Serafina. It wasn't common. It wasn't easy to forget. Someone else responded, said it reminded them of an article from years ago, a tech summit, a scandal. Then, a disappearance. By the end of the week, whispers began to drift through the town like wood smoke, thin, curling, impossible to contain. Could it be her, Serafina Vexley, the heiress to the Vexley fortune, the woman who walked away from a global software company after her father's death, the same woman who vanished after a boardroom fallout, skipping every interview, dodging every camera, leaving behind billions and an empire to rot under new hands? Surely not her. Not in Fern Hollow. Not the woman who kneaded dough in the mornings and swept her own doorstep at night. Not the woman who wore cardigans with frayed sleeves and gave away scones to children with scraped knees. But they whispered all the same. At first it was subtle. Questions about where she came from, why she never left town, how she could afford to keep the bakery open when the rest of Main Street sagged under the weight of the economy. Then it grew bolder. A woman at the hardware store asked outright. A customer from out of town said they'd seen her in a magazine once. Serafina never answered. She just smiled politely, lowered her eyes, and kept her hands busy, bread in the oven, tea in the kettle, orders to fill. Life heard the talk too. A co-worker at the garage mentioned it one afternoon while handing him a wrench. "They say she used to be someone," the man said, smirking. "Big deal. Fancy money. Vanished." Leif didn't look up. "She's still someone," he said, "just not someone who needs proving." And that was the end of that. That night, Serafina stood by the bakery window long after closing. Her reflection was soft in the glass, almost unfamiliar. She touched the pane lightly, then drew the curtain closed. Whatever life she once had, she'd buried it deep in flour and fire. But it was never gone, just waiting for the wind to stir the ashes. The sign flipped to closed just after sunset, but the lights inside Marigold and Hearth stayed on, casting a warm glow that spilled out onto the quiet sidewalk like a secret that refused to sleep. The streets were mostly empty now, except for the occasional dog walker or the hush of tires gliding over wet asphalt. Inside, the last tray of rosemary rolls cooled on the counter, the air thick with the scent of butter and thyme. Life had come by to drop off a small toolbox, nothing urgent, just something Serafina had asked about days ago, and he hadn't forgotten. Amelie had tagged along, her cheeks still pink from the cold, nose pressed to the bakery glass before Serafina waved them in. The girl's eyes lit up. The moment the door opened and the familiar chime rang out. "I didn't mean to keep you," Leif said once inside, wiping his boots on the mat. Serafina shook her head, her apron already untied and hanging on a hook. "You're not." She hesitated, then added, "I was just making tea. Stay for a bit?" Leif glanced at Amelie, who was already peeling off her coat and eyeing the leftover bread basket on the counter. He smiled. "Looks like we're staying." They sat at the window table again, the one that always caught the last sliver of daylight. Serafina brought over mugs of tea, hibiscus for Amelie, black with honey for Leaf, and a plate of still warm rolls with soft butter in a hand-thrown bowl. No one said much, and it wasn't awkward. Amelie hummed while she nibbled on a corner of bread, her boots dangling off the chair. Serafina leaned back in her seat, the weight of the day easing from her shoulders. Leif watched the way the lamplight softened the angles of her face, turning sharpness into something more human. There was no celebration, no special reason. Just three people in a quiet bakery, sharing something that didn't have a name, but felt a lot like peace. As the clock ticked past closing and the world outside grew darker, the warmth inside Marigold Hearth lingered longer than it should have, and no one hurried to leave. The snow started softly, barely more than a whisper, against the window panes. No one noticed at first. Leif was helping Serafina patch a stubborn leak beneath the kitchen sink, half turned under the counter, flashlight clenched between his teeth. Amelie sat nearby on a flour sack, sketching something that involved a dragon, a loaf of bread, and what she claimed was a magical wrench. Serafina brewed tea, the kettle humming behind her like a lullaby no one had requested. But by the time they looked outside again, the town had disappeared beneath a curtain of white. The street lamps glowed faint halos in the snow, casting long, sleepy shadows across untouched sidewalks. The power hadn't gone out, but the town had. Shops were shuttered, cars nowhere in sight. The storm had come fast, unannounced, one of those early snows that crept in before people remembered to check the forecast. Leif checked his phone. No signal, just a red warning banner and a blinking battery. He turned to Serafina. "We're not going anywhere tonight." She didn't flinch. She just nodded once, calm and practical. "There's an old cot in the back. I'll get some blankets for Amelie." Leif opened his mouth to protest, to say they'd manage, but she was already gone. When she returned, she carried a faded quilt and a pillow that smelled faintly of lavender and years gone by. Amelie beamed like it was a sleepover made just for her. Serafina tucked her in near the old brick oven, the heat still radiating gently from earlier baking. Amelie whispered a soft, "Thank you," and was asleep minutes later, rabbit toy clutched to her chest, snow falling beyond the window like a dream made real. Serafina poured Leif another cup of tea and handed it to him without a word. They sat near the front window, the golden light inside contrasting the soft white world outside. No small talk, no explanation, just two people sharing silence like it was something sacred. At one point she looked over. "She trusts you completely." Leif nodded, eyes still on the snow. "She trusts you too." They stayed like that for a long while, until the world turned quiet, and the only sound was the wind brushing against the bakery's bones. Morning didn't feel like an end, just a continuation of something that had started long before the snow. The morning after the snowstorm, the world outside looked like it had been dusted in powdered sugar. The rooftops glistened, the streets were muffled in white. But inside Marigold Hearth, the oven hummed. The scent of cinnamon and browned butter filled the air, and the cold stayed exactly where it belonged, out there. Leif stood at the counter, rolling up his sleeves as Serafina mixed batter for a new batch of walnut scones. Amelie was still asleep on the cot in the back, cocooned in blankets and dreams. The quiet was comfortable, familiar. A rhythm had formed between them, passing tools, reaching for ingredients, sharing smiles that didn't need words to mean something. Serafina stirred slowly, eyes on the bowl, her expression calm. "I used to hate mornings," she said, almost absently. Leif glanced over but said nothing. She added flour to the mix. Everything was scheduled. Breakfast meetings with people I didn't like, calls at 6 a.m. to Tokyo, helicopter rides to nowhere that mattered. Her voice didn't sharpen, but something in it thinned. "I once spent 42 minutes in a room with 3 lawyers arguing over the word promise." Leif raised an eyebrow but still didn't interrupt. She looked up suddenly, like realizing too late that she'd said too much. "That was a long time ago." He leaned back against the counter, watching her for a beat. You don't have to explain. Her hand stilled. I'm not used to people who don't ask. Leif shrugged, lifting a spoon to taste the batter. Then get used to it. Serafina blinked, startled, and then she laughed. Not a loud laugh, not even a full one, just a breath caught and softened, like it had been waiting years for permission to slip free. You're strange, Leif Danner, he grinned. Takes one to know one. She tossed a towel at him, but her smile lingered even after she turned away. The headlines, the deadlines, the life she'd walked away from, they didn't vanish. But they didn't own her anymore either. And for the first time, maybe ever, Serafina realized she didn't have to hide every part of the woman she used to be, not with him. Serafina had grown used to two kinds of men, those who tried to impress her and those who tried to unravel her. Both exhausted her. Both looked at her and saw something they wanted to chase, claim, or conquer. Even when she walked away from that world, changed her clothes, opened a bakery with her own two hands, she still saw it in the eyes of strangers. The flicker of recognition, the hunger for a story, a headline, or a favor. But not with Leif. He came in most mornings now, not as a customer but as someone who belonged. Sometimes with a toolbox, sometimes with Amelie, sometimes with nothing but a quiet hello and an offer to fix the hinge on the pantry door. He never asked about her past, never once said her name like it carried weight, or whispered it like it held mystery. Instead, he asked things like, "Want help peeling apples?" or "Need a second opinion on that shelf you're thinking about moving?" When Serafina mentioned a memory from her old life, a city skyline, a boardroom, a press event, he didn't raise his eyebrows. He didn't joke or dig. He just nodded, as if she'd said she used to live near the ocean or once had a dog named Clover, like it mattered because it was hers, not because it meant anything to anyone else. And because of that, she breathed easier around him. She didn't have to fill the silence when they worked side by side, didn't have to smile when she didn't feel like smiling. He didn't flatter her, didn't throw compliments like sugar to mask something else. If he liked her bread, he said so. If he didn't, he'd tell her it was a little too dense, and then offer to help knead the next batch. She caught herself one afternoon leaning against the counter, watching him wipe his hands on a towel after helping her lift flour bags into storage. There was no angle to him, no performance, just Leif. Solid, quiet, kind in a way that didn't need explaining, and in that stillness, Serafina felt something rare, safe, unjudged, known. It was a slow afternoon at Marigold and Hearth, the kind that invited time to stretch and settle into the corners. The oven was off for once, the scent of cinnamon lingering from the morning's batch of rolls. Outside, the town moved lazily under a sky streaked with watercolor gray. Inside, warmth pooled in quiet places, between words, in glances, in the clink of teacups on saucers. Amelie sat at the window table, legs swinging beneath her chair, a handful of crayons scattered around her like fallen leaves. She had her tongue between her teeth, the way she did when she was concentrating hard. A blank sheet of butcher paper from the bakery's back room lay before her, slowly coming to life in color and shape. Leif leaned against the counter nearby, sipping tea while Serafina rearranged the front display, not because she had to, but because she liked things to feel fresh. Neither of them paid much attention to Amelie at first. She often drew while they worked. Dragons, trees with names, her favorite scones. But today was different. When she was done, Amelie stood quietly and crossed the room with the drawing pressed against her chest. "Miss Sarah?" Serafina turned, drying her hands on a linen towel. "Hmm?" "I made this," Amelie said, and held it up. The paper was filled with color, a bakery with a golden window and potted marigolds flanking the door. Inside, 3 figures, one tall with a tool belt, one small in a purple coat, and one with her hair in a bun, holding a tray of something sweet. Underneath, written in crooked crayon letters, "Our corner of the world." Serafina stared at it, throat tightening unexpectedly. The drawing wasn't perfect, the perspective was off, and the marigolds looked like sunbursts, but it was true, somehow impossibly. It was true. Leif leaned in to look, smiling softly. She's good with details. Amelie beamed. That's you, Miss Sarah. That's me and Dad. That's our bakery. Serafina crouched beside her, touched the paper gently. Is it really ours? She asked. Amelie nodded. Well, it feels like it. And Serafina, who had once owned boardrooms and buildings, felt something more valuable take root in her chest, a corner of the world. And for the first time, it felt like home. The offer came on a Tuesday morning, quiet and unceremonious, slipped into the space between a coffee refill and a tray of lemon poppy seed muffins. The bakery was still waking up, sunlight filtering through the golden window, catching the dust that danced lazily in the beams. Leif had come by early, like he usually did, to help tighten a loose shelf bracket behind the counter. Amelie was at school, and the bakery hadn't yet opened its door to the world. Serafina poured him a cup of tea without asking, then hesitated for a moment, fingers lingering on the ceramic. I've been thinking, she said, her voice calm but cautious. You could use a new set. Leif looked up from the open toolbox at his feet. A new set? She nodded toward the battered old kit, full of mismatched wrenches and screwdrivers dulled by time and repetition. Tools, ones that don't require coaxing or duct tape. He gave a small chuckle. They still do the job. I know, but... She paused, then met his eyes. Let me buy you a proper set, for everything you've helped me with. It's not charity, it's gratitude. Leif leaned back on his heels, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked at her, not just at her face, but at the intention behind it, the softness in her voice, the earnestness, and then he shook his head. Thank you, he said, gentle but firm, but I've got what I need. Serafina frowned slightly, confused. Leif? He gestured to the toolbox. These tools? They've been with me longer than most people. They've fixed engines, leaky sinks, even held up Amelie's crib once. They might be ugly, but they're mine. She tilted her head, still watching him. What I need, he said, standing slowly, I already have. You can't buy trust, or purpose, or good hands. Serafina was quiet, the refusal hanging in the air not as offense but as truth. I wasn't trying to fix anything, she murmured. I know, he replied, but not everything that's old needs replacing. And with that he closed the lid of his toolbox, the latch clicking shut like a quiet punctuation mark. Neither of them needed to explain. It didn't happen all at once. Fern Hollow was the kind of place where people noticed things slowly, like the seasons changing or a fence finally painted after years of flaking. The townsfolk weren't cold, just cautious, especially with outsiders, especially with someone like Serafina Vexley, who had drifted into their world with elegant hands and a name too polished for a place like this. But something shifted. It started with the apple pie. One slice given to Mrs. Callahan after her knee surgery. No charge, just wrapped in parchment with a note that read, Hope this brings you some comfort. Then came the strawberry tart for a widower who hadn't smiled in months. The spiced pumpkin scones Serafina left at the fire station on a rainy morning. She never made a show of it, never posted photos or expected gratitude. She just gave. And slowly the town began to give back. First it was curious glances, then nods, then real conversation. By winter's end, the coffee shop owner was trading beans for croissants, and the local librarian stopped in every Thursday for a blackberry muffin and a chapter of whatever Serafina had just finished reading. Even old man Whitaker, who hadn't trusted anyone since his cat went missing in 1992, began leaving exact change on the counter without a word. They didn't warm to her because of her name or the whispers about who she used to be. They warmed to her because her pies tasted like home and her silence felt like respect, because she remembered how people took their tea and didn't flinch when the wind howled through the door and someone came in dripping wet and broken-hearted. And because Serafina didn't try to prove anything, she just kept baking, kept showing up, and somewhere between the cinnamon rolls and the marigolds in the windowsill, The town stopped calling her that new woman at the bakery. They started calling her Miss Sarah. Not because they knew her past, but because they knew her now. The lavender cupcake had always been a quiet thing, tucked in the back corner of the display, delicate and soft-spoken, with swirls of pale frosting and a white chocolate star resting at the top. It wasn't the best seller. Most customers overlooked it, reaching instead for the flashier lemon meringue or the rich double chocolate ganache. Serafina never minded. Some recipes weren't meant to be loud. But one afternoon, Amelie wandered behind the counter, the way children do when they feel like they belong. She stood on her tiptoes, peered into the display, and pointed to the cupcake with reverence. "That's the one you gave me," she said. "The one that said, 'For someone brave.'" Serafina smiled softly. "You remembered." Amelie nodded. "It's still my favorite." Leif, watching from across the room, just sipped his tea and let the moment breathe. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Later that night, after the bakery had closed and the ovens had cooled, Serafina stood alone with a pen and a slip of thick cardstock. She stared at the name, Lavender Star, and crossed it out. In its place she wrote, "Amelie's Courage." No fanfare, no explanation. By the end of the week, customers began asking about it. "What's the story?" they'd say. "Who's Amelie?" And Serafina would smile in that quiet way of hers and reply, "Someone very small and very brave." Orders tripled. Parents came in to buy them for children facing piano recitals and school presentations. A teenage girl bought one before her driver's test. A retired nurse bought two after getting news from the hospital. They didn't know Amelie, but they understood courage. Serafina didn't expect the attention, but she didn't shy away from it either, not this time. And the strangest thing? She smiled more now. Not the practiced smile from her old life, the one she used in interviews and polished boardrooms. This one was softer, less rehearsed, like it was rising from something inside her she'd forgotten still existed. Because in naming that cupcake, she hadn't just honored a little girl. She'd honored a moment of truth and let it stay. It was late, long after the bakery had closed and the last loaf had cooled. The lights were low, the air scented faintly with cinnamon and cooling butter, and Amelie had fallen asleep in the back room again, wrapped in the same quilt Serafina always kept folded on the cot. Leif lingered in the corner near the sink, wiping his hands on a towel more out of habit than necessity. Serafina sat across from him, elbows on the table, sleeves rolled to her elbows, a cup of tea growing cold in front of her. She looked tired in the way people do when they've had a good day, the kind of fatigue that comes from fullness, not from absence. Leif didn't speak right away. He never rushed into things. But then he glanced toward the kitchen, where Amelie lay sleeping beneath soft light, and he said, "I used to have this idea." Serafina looked up, curious. "Yeah?" He nodded slowly, folding the towel over itself. "Back before life got so tight, when I still had a few more hours in the day to imagine things." "What kind of idea?" Leif looked down at his hands, calloused and worn. "A mentorship program for kids who didn't have much, high schoolers, maybe even middle schoolers, the ones who got overlooked." He met her eyes. "Teach them how to fix things, cars, bikes, water heaters. Show them what work can look like when you're good with your hands." Serafina listened without blinking. No interruptions, no polite nods, just stillness. The kind that made people say more than they meant to. "I wanted to call it the Fix-It Crew," Leif continued, a small smile playing at his lips. "I even made a flyer once, thought maybe I'd get the town on board. But then Emily was born, and then everything else happened." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. Serafina leaned forward, resting her chin lightly on one hand. "You should do it," she said softly. Leif chuckled. "I don't even know if I have the time." Her voice didn't change. "Then we'll make time." And in the pause that followed, it wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a door cracking open, one she was ready to help him walk through. She didn't just hear the plan, she heard him. The email came in just after sunrise, buried beneath newsletters and order confirmations in a mailbox Serafina rarely checked anymore. She only opened it that morning to send a delivery invoice to the flour mill. But there it was. Subject line simple, familiar, sharp as the edge of a knife. "Long time, Sarah. Let's talk." She almost didn't open it, but curiosity, that old ghost, pulled at her. Inside, it was brief. Too brief. From Elise Kavanaugh, her former assistant, the only person who'd stayed loyal when everything else collapsed. Elise had tracked her down somehow. No threats, no demands, just a breadcrumb back to the past. "I'm consulting now with Vexley Holdings. They'd like to discuss options, possible speaking engagements. A short feature in Wired, maybe? There's interest in your story. Still time to come back. No pressure. Just think about it." Underneath it, her old calendar, already color-coded with fake appointments waiting to be filled. Serafina stared at the screen. The bakery was still quiet around her, morning light beginning to rise through the golden window. She could hear the faint hum of the oven preheating, the rustle of leaf outside sweeping snow from the doorstep. Amelie would be skipping through the front door in under an hour, dragging in cold air and conversation, and asking if the cinnamon rolls had extra glaze today. And here was the life she'd buried, asking to be unearthed. She hovered over the keyboard. She thought about the headlines, the hotel ballrooms, the jet lag, and the applause that never felt like love. And then she hit delete. No second guess, no draft saved for later, just gone. She closed the laptop, stood up, and turned toward the counter where dough waited to be rolled. Outside, life tapped on the glass and waved, cheeks pink from the cold. She smiled back, flour already clinging to her sleeves. Let them write stories. She was too busy living the one she chose. The classroom smelled faintly of crayons, pencil shavings, and juice boxes, an odd combination that somehow always made Leaf nostalgic. He stood quietly in the back, arms crossed, watching from a corner near the coat rack as the second-grade teacher gestured to the front of the room. "All right, class," she said, smiling. "It's time for show and tell. Who's ready to go first today?" Hands shot into the air like popcorn, but Amelie didn't raise hers. Not yet. She just clutched the small white box in her hands a little tighter, the one she'd insisted on bringing from home that morning. It had a faded ribbon around it and a smudge of frosting still etched into one corner from days ago. The teacher glanced around. "Amelie, would you like to go first today?" Amelie stood slowly, her bunny hair clipped slightly crooked, and walked to the front with the box hugged close to her chest. She placed it carefully on the table, then turned to face the class. "This," she said, lifting the lid gently, "is a cupcake box from Marigold and Hearth. It doesn't have a cupcake in it now, but it did." The kids leaned forward, eyes big. One boy whispered, "Is it magic?" Amelie smiled. "Kind of, because this cupcake saved my birthday." She held up the box so they could all see. It was lavender with a little star on top, and it came with a note that said, "For someone brave." A quiet murmur rippled through the classroom. "My dad didn't have a lot of money that day," she said, her voice small but sure. "But we went to the bakery, and the lady there, Miss Sarah, she gave us the cake anyway. And she put this cupcake in the bag just for me." She looked down at the box, then back at the room, her eyes a little shinier now. "It wasn't just a cupcake. It made me feel brave. And it gave me a new friend." The teacher blinked quickly, pressing a hand to her chest. Leaf swallowed hard, unseen in the back. The class clapped softly, not out of obligation, but because somehow they understood. Sometimes the smallest things carry the heaviest kindness, and sometimes a cupcake is so much more than just a treat. The bakery was quiet after dusk, the ovens cooling, the chairs turned upside down on tables, and the golden window casting its last honeyed glow across the empty floor. Serafina sat in the corner booth with her journal open, a mug of tea cooling beside her, and her pen tapping slowly against the page. She hadn't written in weeks, not because she'd forgotten, but because she was afraid of what might come out if she let herself speak too freely. But tonight, something inside her cracked open. Not in a painful way, more like how frost thaws when the light lingers just long enough. She touched her pen to the paper and, without planning to, began writing, not to someone else, but to herself. Dear Sarah, you did it. Not the way they expected, not with speeches and stocks and staged applause, but this quiet corner of the world, you built it with your own hands. Flower-dusted fingers, morning light, smiles you didn't have to fake. They told you what your life should look like. They paved it in gold and lit it with expectation. And you walked away. You lost things, yes. Money, reputation, a seat at the table. But here, you found your name again. This is the life you wanted, not the one they built for you. She paused, reading over the words as though they belonged to someone else. But they didn't. They were hers, every line etched from truth, not fear. She kept writing. You are not less because you left. You are not small because you chose quiet. You are whole in this space. With your bread, your tea, your people. She closed the journal carefully, fingers lingering on the worn leather cover. No headlines would be written about this moment, no interviews or press releases. But it was the truest thing she'd ever written. Across the room, the wall clock ticked on, the world still turning. And for once, Serafina Vexley didn't feel behind. She felt home. The morning it went up, the town hadn't yet stirred. The air was still crisp, the streets washed in that blue-gray hush that only exists just before sunrise. Leif stood on the ladder with a wrench in one hand, the other steadying the wooden sign as he secured the final bolt. Below him, Serafina stood with her hands in her coat pockets, eyes squinting upward, hair pulled back, cheeks pink from the cold. They hadn't told anyone. No announcement. No ribbon cutting, just a quiet agreement that it was time. The old sign had served its purpose, soft gold lettering, slightly faded from weather and sun. Marigold and hearth had always been hers, in name and in labor, but now it was something else, something shared, something neither of them had words for, but both had felt growing beneath the flower-dusted floors and hand-fixed pipes. When Leif climbed down, Serafina took a step forward. The new sign gleamed with morning dew. Marigold and hearth, Danner and Vexley crafted with grace, baked in grit. She stared at it a long time. He nudged her lightly. Too much? She shook her head slowly, eyes still on the sign. It's perfect. The names sat side by side like they always should have been, not titles, not brands, but something closer to roots. Danner and Vexley. A man who fixed what people gave up on, a woman who walked away from everything to find something real. People noticed the sign within hours. The post office clerk who picked up muffins on Fridays, the nurse who stopped in after her night shift, Mrs. Callahan, whose knee had healed but still came in for tea. All of them paused, squinted up, smiled. No one questioned it. No one asked why. They just understood. Inside, Amelie taped up a hand-drawn version of the new sign in the corner window. Her version had flowers growing between the letters and hearts. Serafina stepped back inside, watching the light filter through the glass. The bakery hadn't changed, but now it had a name that told the truth. The morning started with the scent of cinnamon and orange zest wafting out of the open bakery door. The chill hadn't yet left the air, but something warmer was drawing people out of their homes, down the sidewalks, past the post office and the diner, and straight to the heart of Main Street, Marigold and Hearth. There was no flyer, no official invite, just a chalkboard sign leaning against the door that read in Serafina's careful script. Community Bake Day. Bring a recipe, bring a story, bring yourself. They came slowly at first. Mr. Halbrook brought his late wife's cornbread recipe, written on an index card stained with thyme and butter. The Murphy twins carried in a tray of peanut brittle so sweet it nearly glued their fingers together. A retired school teacher arrived with jars of homemade jam. A teenager came with no recipe at all, just wide eyes and the hope someone would show him how to whisk properly. Serafina didn't command. She welcomed. She moved from counter to oven, apron dusted, hair loose, her hands guiding old hands and new. Life worked beside her, sleeves rolled, showing two kids how to knead dough without smashing it into a wall. Amelie passed out napkins and stories in equal measure, her laugh bubbling louder than the coffee pot. Flour spilled, sugar coated the floor. Someone burned a batch of biscuits, and no one cared. Because the bakery had become something more than a shop that day. It became a town table. A place where strangers leaned in closer, where neighbors who hadn't spoken in years rolled out pastry together and argued, lightly, lovingly, about the right amount of nutmeg. Where everyone, no matter how old or alone or unsure, had a place to stand and something to contribute. When the sun climbed high and the tables overflowed with pies and rolls and jam-filled thumbprints, Serafina stepped back, hands on her hips, breath caught in her throat. This, not the empire she once inherited, not the one she walked away from. This, people elbow-deep in flour, laughter hanging in the rafters, stories rising like steam. This was the life she built, and it was rising perfectly. The evening had settled into its favorite rhythm, soft lamplight, cooling tea, and the faint scent of lemon loaf still lingering in the corners of marigolden hearth. The bakery had closed hours ago, but the warmth lingered, as it always did when the day ended with full bellies and fuller hearts. Leif sat on the bench near the front window, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug, watching the town outside disappear into twilight. Amelie was curled beside him, legs tucked underneath her, a crayon still clutched loosely in one hand, and a piece of drawing paper resting across her lap. It showed three figures standing in front of the bakery, one with a ponytail and an apron, one tall with a tool belt, and one small with a rabbit toy in her arms. A new family drawn in crooked lines and bright colors. She didn't look up when she asked it. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. "Dad, if I wished for a mom, and she just sort of showed up, is that magic?" Leif blinked, the question landing heavier than she could know. He looked down at her, but she was still staring at the drawing, chewing the inside of her cheek like she didn't expect an answer, just needed to say it out loud. He didn't answer right away. He thought about Serafina, somewhere in the back now, cleaning up in that slow, thoughtful way of hers. The way she remembered how he took his tea, the way she leaned in when Amelie talked, like every word deserved a front-row seat. The way she never tried to replace anything, but somehow, without trying, had filled the quiet places they didn't talk about. He looked back at his daughter. "Maybe it is," he said finally. "Maybe it's the kind of magic you can't plan for." Amelie smiled, just barely, then rested her head against his arm. "I hope it stays," she whispered. Leif kissed the top of her head, the drawing fluttering slightly in her lap. "So do I, Bug," he murmured. "So do I." The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for anything, just rests gently over the world like a well-worn quilt. The bakery was clean and still, the chairs back in place, the counter wiped down, the scent of baked apples clinging faintly to the air. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily beneath the glow of the street lamp, and Amelie had already fallen asleep on the couch in the back, her arms curled around her rabbit, a paper crown askew on her head from that afternoon's pretend royal tea. Leif sat at the window table, mug of tea in hand, watching the snow collect in little piles along the sidewalk. Across from him, Serafina moved quietly, tying her apron behind her back before sliding into the seat across from him, her expression unreadable but not distant. They sat in companionable silence, the warmth between them built not from words but from all the days before this one, the shared dough, the shared glances, the unspoken laughter. the closeness that comes when two people stop waiting for the right moment and start noticing the one they're already in. Then, Serafina reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a napkin, folded neatly, square edges aligned like she'd been carrying it for hours, waiting for a breath steady enough to let it go. She placed it gently in front of him, eyes still on her hands. Leif blinked, then unfolded it slowly. Scrawled in her neat, looping handwriting were just a few words. Would it be okay if we stayed like this? For good? No question mark. Just the quiet courage of someone who had built her life again, piece by piece. And was now placing the last one in someone else's hands. Leif looked up. She was already watching him. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He reached across the table, folded his hand over hers, and nodded once. Firm, certain. Serafina let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, something even quieter settled into place. It began with a photo, not one they posed for, not one they knew had been taken. Just a candid, quiet shot, snapped during the community bake day. Serafina laughing, flower on her cheek, Amelie perched on a stool beside her, Leif in the background, sleeves rolled, smiling at them both like he hadn't smiled in years. Someone had posted it to a small-town Facebook page with the caption, "Magic in Fern Hollow." And somehow, it spread. The article came out a week later. It wasn't splashy or cruel, just honest. A quiet profile in a well-read digital magazine, tucked between headlines about politics and tech. But there it was, impossible to ignore. Heiress becomes baker. Mechanic builds her a roof. Together, they build a family. It told their story, the real one. About a woman who'd vanished from boardrooms and glossy covers, only to reappear years later in a sleepy mountain town, serving tea and kneading bread with hands that had once signed billion-dollar deals. It spoke of a widowed mechanic with a daughter who believed in magic and a bakery where something more than pastries had risen between them. Serafina read it early one morning, the oven still warming, the town still asleep. She stared at the screen for a long time. It didn't feel invasive, just true and tender in a way that made her heart ache. She printed a copy and slid it into a folder, not for display, just for keeping. When Leif arrived later that morning, she handed him the page without a word. He scanned it once, then twice. Amelie peeked over his shoulder, reading the headline out loud. "Wait," she whispered. "Is that us?" Leif looked at Serafina, a smile pulling at the edge of his mouth. "Looks like someone told the story anyway." She exhaled, but it wasn't fear, it wasn't dread, it was relief. Because for once the truth had followed her, and chosen to be kind. The scent of warm bread still drifted out from the golden window every morning, just as it had decades earlier. The marigolds on the sill bloomed faithfully each spring, their petals vibrant against the worn bricks of the shop's front. Inside, the floors creaked the same way they always had, and the little bell above the door still chimed with the same soft charm that made people pause when they walked in. But everything was different now, too, because the girl who once traced hearts in frosting with her fingers and believed in quiet magic had grown up. Amelie stood behind the counter, apron tied neatly at her waist, her sleeves rolled just like her father used to, and her hair pulled into a low bun that never stayed quite in place, just like Serafina's had. The bakery was hers now, not in a way that felt inherited, but in a way that felt lived into, earned, breathed, baked into the walls. She kept the name, Marigold and Hearth, Danner and Vexley. She added one more plaque beneath it, now and always home. People came from nearby towns, from cities, from places that had only heard whispers of the place where a mechanic and a runaway heiress built something sweeter than fortune. Every so often someone would ask, "How did it all begin?" And Amelie would smile, the same crooked smile she had as a child, and say without hesitation, It started with a jar of coins and a cupcake that made everything possible. She never said more than that, because the rest they could feel in the air, in the cinnamon, the warmth, the softness of the light, in every corner of the shop where flour dust danced and fire still lived gently inside the oven. She hadn't just inherited a bakery, she'd inherited their story, and every morning she opened the door, she told it again, without ever needing to speak.